So I'll just quickly, change my hat over to the moderating. And you've just gotten this, we would like to record the event. So you've just gotten this button to accept that. All right. I don't know, Johannes, perhaps we should wait until the full hour to begin. I just had to look at the clock, or would you like to start? If not, we could have a 5-minute
No,
break
I
for
think we should because Marius, I think, also isn't here. Oh, yeah, he is. Sorry.
Marius is here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, okay. Um, I don't know. We can start, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I would like to welcome you to this first session on democratic economic planning in the Anthropocene. As the need for societies to transition towards sustainable production systems become more evident through the polycrisis of the present and our growing scientific understanding of the root causes, the bioeconomy offers a particular solution. It promises a transition to renewable biological resources and circular process, especially through markets. And as just mentioned, various governments have followed bioeconomy strategies. However, within these bioeconomy strategies, the questions of who decides on what resources are used, for whose benefit, and under what principles remain largely left to a more or less regulated market. By contrast, however, democratic economic planning suggests more radical models that would enable a collective decision-making for a fair distribution of resources to ensure that socio-ecological transformation will serve the public good rather than private interests of established or emerging economic actors. Starting from this re-emerging discussion on democratic and ecological planning, the following presentations critically interrogate dominant assumptions about economic organization, questioning growth-oriented and market-driven approaches to managing resources from ecological and feminist perspectives. By emphasizing collective decision-making based on ecological principles and the ethics of care, this workshop will point toward the need for a different political and economic system, one that can truly confront ecological limits and social inequalities. The papers that will be presented thus ask us to rethink not only just policy instruments, but the very foundations of economic life in a time of planetary Anthropocene crisis. And with that, I'm happy to present our first speaker, who is Drew Pendergrass. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Duke University. He is trained as a climate scientist, and his research uses satellite observations of the atmosphere to track greenhouse gases and other pollutants back to their sources. He co-authored the book Half-Earth Socialism, which came out in Verso in 2022, with historian Troy Vetesev. I got that, okay. I'm not sure if I botched up his name. And the pair, so Drew and Troy, have another book under contract on direct democracy, ecology, and economic planning. His popular environmental writing has been published in Harper's, The Guardian, and Jacobin. Thank you very much, Drew, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to present to you all. Would I be able to share my screen? I have a few slides.
I hope so. Otherwise, I will make you co-host, and then you should definitely be able. Could you try to share it once, and then?
It says sharing is not true. Oh, there it goes. Now it works. There we go. Okay, great. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for having me. I'm Drew. You know, by day I'm a scientist, but I moonlight as a social scientist. So forgive me for my intrusion. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about some economic planning, but I'm going to frame it in terms of some of the arguments against democratic economic planning. So I'm going to identify 3 of the most powerful arguments against economic planning. The problem of information, which I associate with Friedrich Hayek. There's the problem of institutions, which I'll define in some detail. That's going to be the main focus of this talk, because this is the main thing that I've worked on in Troy and I's collaboration by the economist Janos Kornai. And finally, the problem of experts and expertise, which was posed by the sophist philosopher Gorgias. So by engaging with the critiques from the first two theorists, in particular epistemic arguments against democratic planning, we can establish a negative relief of what economic democracy and what socialism must be. The failures of economic reform efforts in Eastern Europe in the 1960s raised questions that go beyond the problematic raised by Hayek and Kornai, and we argue is answered by incongruent but interestingly aligned debates in the 1960s in the Caribbean. In 1956, the historian and activist C.L.R. James offered ancient Athens as a model of socialist governance in his pamphlet, Every Cook Can Govern. And this proposal was taken up by other socialists in the Caribbean New Left, who theorized how direct democracy could give control of the economy to the people without the mediation of a despotic bureaucracy or despotic markets. So we engage with Gorgias's epistemic critique of democracy at the end, because he has this critique based on expertise, and can ordinary people be experts? By proceeding through these three problems, we end with our belief that under socialism, every cook can plan. Right. So the workplace is a dictatorship. So goes a common radical saying, as every worker knows that even in a so-called democracy, people spend the bulk of their day ruled by institutions of what Elizabeth Anderson calls private government, where they are subject to arbitrary demands from unaccountable bosses. This contradiction, Anderson notices, springs from capitalist society's unusual division into political and economic spheres. In the political sphere, everyone has nominally equal rights, whereas in the economic sphere, the rich exercise great power both within and between firms. The need for capital's perpetual self-expansion constrains the political sphere's ability to influence the economy. Even radical governments can only go so far in democratizing the economy before provoking capitalist revolt. We believe that achieving democracy in both spheres is possible, but only by seeing problems as intertwined and mutually soluble. And in fact, we define socialism as the expansion of democratic political control over the economy. So I'll argue in this talk that substantive enduring economic democracy must rely on non-market mechanisms. This is because of the mute compulsion required for markets to organize production. I'll talk about that in quite a bit of detail later. Socialist planning is not an easy path because it ends too often in despotism. That's why these critiques of planning are so important to engage with, to kind of work out the contours of how we can do substantively democratic economic planning. So I'll start with the most famous critique, perhaps, of socialist planning, which is from Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was one of these founding fathers of neoliberal economic thought, and his critique of socialism remains one of the most powerful broadsides against planning, and it continues to influence neoliberals and other opponents of socialism to this day. In two seminal essays, Economics and Knowledge from 1937 and The Use of Knowledge in Society in 1945, Hayek argues that planners would have trouble concentrating information dispersed in society, which can be better distilled through price signals produced by market activity. So this is the knowledge problem, that the man on the spot knows something that the planner does not. This is later complemented by what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge, this subtle, uncodified, unarticulated knowledge gleaned from years of experience. Hayek doubted that this knowledge could be transmitted to a planning bureau. But the price system allows individuals to act with little knowledge. If I own a factory, I don't need to know why tin has gone scarce. I just know that the price of tin has risen, and that I must, if I can, I should substitute another material for this increased price. Don't need to know that there was a strike at a factory across the world. So Hayek's critique is often perceived as a catch-all explanation for the failure of the Eastern Bloc's planning apparatus. The planners in actually existing socialism understood their failures differently. So I'm going to look at a closer examination of the reform period in the 1960s, and revealing a slightly more subtle problem than this problem of information, leading to the inflexibility of planning bureaucracies. So I'll talk about this issue through the work of the Hungarian economist and planner Johannes Kornai, who's the white fella in this picture here sitting in the front. And I'll just flag here that this is an economics talk in some ways, so you'll notice a certain lack of diversity in some of these figures here. The prehistory of the reform period began in 1939 with the mathematician Leonid Kantorovich, who published his work on linear programming, or what he called optimal planning, which eventually revolutionized economics in both capitalist and communist worlds, especially after Stalin's death in 1953. Linear programming efficiently optimizes an equation within constraints expressed as inequalities. So this is very common technique to this day. It's used in planning renewable energy systems, etc. The basic idea is it's a visual algorithm. You draw inequalities as lines here, and Kantorovich's insight is that you only have to check the corners to find the optimal solution. So in this problem that I've shown here, you can optimize some function only by checking 4 points, basically, rather than what was done before, which is you check like everything. So it made solving paper problems on pen and paper much easier. So this was great before computers, for example. It was really, really helpful. Linear programming raised the possibility of a scientifically planned socialism within the Eastern Bloc. He developed this algorithm in helping plan plywood production at a factory. And he quickly thought, well, maybe the whole Soviet Union could be conceived of as a factory that could be programmed in this way. And this idea was that it could supersede Gosplan and ad hoc factory management. We could have some sort of rational technocratic governance of socialism. And a flurry of ideal type models and new planning algorithms appeared in the 1960s, both in the US and capitalist worlds and in socialist worlds, inspired by this algorithm. So one such example was offered by Janusz Kornai. So Kornai was an economist who was kind of put out to pasture in 1956 because he was involved in the Hungarian Revolution. He was one of the protesters pushing for democracy. And so they put him in the worst place that they could put him, which is as a small regional textile planner. So he was working with the cotton industry to try and plan production of fabric. But his application of linear programming to improve textile production quickly won him professional accolades. And as tensions began to ease in 1963, he was invited back in from the provinces to work in the computing center of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, although he was never allowed in the planning bureau because he was too politically toxic. And Kornai got a huge grant and was able to hire 200 economists to try and computerize the Hungarian economy. This is in the 1960s. And their goal was to mathematically calculate the next 5-year plan. It was not a thought experiment, it was real planning. So, quote, influenced by tactical considerations, Kornai, quote, did not want planners to see those working with the models and computers as rivals. So rather than attempting to replace the planning bureau, he sought to prove his usefulness by taking the official plan as the starting point and only promised to, quote, provide a plan that produced everything the plan produced by traditional methods would, and then as a bonus, leave Hungary less indebted than before. So he's trying to be very politically savvy about how he's intervening in this planning from outside with these new algorithms. So Kornai's careful politics work. Built out of punch cards and magnetic type, his model optimized 4,479 economic activity variables subject to 2,055 constraints. Some of them are listed here. So things like how many laborers do we have? Where's our stuff? What's our capacity? All sorts of things like that. And yielding a complex production investment, technical development, and forward train plan with respect to 491 priority products. That's a quote. So to reduce computation to a tractable form, he aggregated data into indices. So the goal was never to plan every factory at once, but rather to plan aggregate indices, which would then be passed on to factory managers who would offer critiques and thoughts on how the optimization looked, and that would feed back to the center where they would adjust their parameters and make a new plan. So the way this would work is through something called shadow prices. This is a mathematical artifact of an optimization procedure. It's sort of like marginal price, but it's something that you can obtain purely through planning, purely through computation. I talk about this in quite a bit of detail in the essay version of this talk, which is forthcoming in an edited volume, and this is going to be part of Troy and I's new book. So I won't go into too much detail here, but the idea is that you use optimization to produce plans meeting the same goals as the Planning Bureau, but with substantial savings depending on what you're optimizing. So here are the different optimizations that Kornai performed. So you could minimize investment inputs. So forints is the currency of Hungary. We could save 15 billion forints. If we wanted, we could save labor time. If we want to optimize labor time, we could save, we could trade as little with the capitalist world as we wanted to. We could maximize consumption. Kornai is basically saying, you know, pick your favorite thing that you want to optimize, so we can optimize it. So if you want free time or you want stuff, we can give it to you. But of course this didn't work. Why didn't it work? Kornai's discovery was that in practice, long-term plans could be devised using aggregate indices, and the center only needed a coarse understanding of the economy's function. So the details could be handled by the sectoral bodies in the firms themselves. The plan's not perfect, but it's good enough, and in fact, significantly better than the plans produced by the center. And in fact, Kornai was so happy with the actual paper plans produced by this that he was disabused of his previous like of Friedrich Hayek. So Kornai writes that the Western neoliberals show a particular intellectual relation to the naive group of reformers of the socialist economy. He wrote this in like the 70s. Advocates of the proposal that the functioning of the economy should look exclusively to the market. However, in the practical consideration of the reform, the naivety of these views became more and more conspicuous. We do not believe there remains a single Hungarian economist who would take this view. So the experience of this planning exercise convinced Kornai and his colleagues, who were quite sympathetic to neoliberal critiques of planning, that in fact this information problem was not really the core problem. But Kornai does discover a much more problematic issue in his attempt at reform, that is the problem of institutions, and what I'm calling the problem of institutions. So even if Kornai no longer found Hayek's critique convincing, in the process of developing a computationally planned economy, he discovered a far more devastating problem. The problem was not primarily informational, as Hayek argued, but rather institutional. So in analogous reform efforts in the Soviet Union at the time, headquartered at System for the Optimal Functioning of the Economy, SOF, would-be reformers proposed a system of computational planning that would obtain live data from enterprises across the USSR, a Soviet internet, as was written by in a recent book. However, while enterprise leadership was willing to supply accurate data in the course of their training to use SOF and their experiments to design the system, as soon as the plans became binding, people started misrepresenting their numbers to the system. The idea is that the institutional arrangement, the existing arrangement, where individual bodies were evaluated by their achievement of plan targets, ran contrary to the informational needs of the algorithmic plan formation. So, in short, you want to represent what you need in such a way that you get the materials you need to meet the plan. So it's sort of a game that you're playing, an informational game where you might misrepresent your needs to get the things you need. And this does not require any cynicism. This could be people genuinely trying to meet the plan, and they want to make sure they have extra materials so there's no shortages, etc. The political struggles between institutions in the Eastern Bloc were a far greater challenge to planning reform than Hayek's information problem. So, this planning was perceived as a threat to power. So, Kornai takes from all this ideas that without institutions willing to carry out a plan, they remain little more than utopian figments. It's just a piece of paper ultimately. If the institutions aren't arranged such that this plan can be implemented, it's just this really optimized set of equations. So Kornai argued from this experience that an economy, capitalist, socialist, or otherwise, is divided into a real sphere and a control sphere. That's in this diagram on the right here. The real sphere is physical, factories, goods, workers, and the control sphere is intangible, plans, prices, markets. The real sphere is where the economy worked under the direction of the control sphere. Under capitalism, to Kornai, money is an instrument of both the real and the control sphere. Prices, as Hayek correctly argued, produces information, but much more importantly, it produces coercion. If a capitalist ignores the rising price of a good, they will be punished with bankruptcy. If I, as a worker, ignore the prices of my needs, I will become homeless, especially in the US, less so in Europe, but increasingly you're becoming like us. The automatic connection between real and control sphere is missing in socialist planning. The plan was a function of the control sphere, but it lacks any connection, organic connection to the real sphere. It summarizes this view with the idea of the soft budget constraint. So firms under socialism need not balance their budgets because what ultimately matters is good relations with their associated planning bureau. The budgets are just an accounting tool. They're not coercive in the same way that capitalist bankruptcy is. So here's a psychotic diagram that I'm going to explain to you now, summarizing Kornai's views. So Kornai saw that argued that there are only two stable arrangements for a complex modern economy. You can either have capitalism, where there's an organic connection between the real and the control sphere implemented by money. So you have the control sphere, you have prices, and they coordinate the real economy coercively through mute compulsion is a Marxist term, but basically by threatening people with bankruptcy, homelessness, etc., if they don't obey the prices. And then the information from the real economy feeds back into the control sphere from price signals. So sort of a Hayekian Marxist fusion idea of capitalism from Kornai. The other way you can do this is through regular compulsion. So rather than the mute compulsion of capitalism, you can have the evolution of Stalinist institutions. So he has this sort of evolutionary account of socialist despotism in Eastern Europe, where basically you have a plan, and then you need institutions that are able to coercively carry out that plan because there's not an organic connection between plan and action. So he basically argued that attempts to make socialism friendlier would fail because you need the coercion to make the real sphere and the control sphere interact, and that there's actually reasons for the reason why things work the way it is. So given this binary that he produces, you either have these two ways of connecting real and control spheres. Kornai argued that there should be a transition to capitalism. And he was incredibly influential in this argument. There's lots of work on Kornai's influence over Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese transition, and then also shock therapy in the West, although he opposed shock therapy, but in Eastern Europe. So very influential argument, this. So this is terrible news, because if Kornai is right, there's no hope for a world beyond capitalism. And I'll wrap up soon. The workplace may be a dictatorship, and workers may be coerced to toil by the relentless threats of homelessness, hunger, and untreated sickness, but market-based terrors are preferable to political terror. So this is where I'm just going to talk about direct democracy, because I talked too long about Kornai. I always do this. So the basic idea here is that there's a fair number of Caribbean theorists who are responding to this this moment in the 60s of reform in a sort of parallel fashion. So this conflict between direct democracy and technocratic planning is not merely a figment of our imagination. The basic idea that we're arguing here is that direct democracy is a third way of making control sphere and the real sphere interacted, because if you have the same people implementing the plan, producing the plan, so workers are involved in the production of the plan, then you have this sort of legitimacy solution. People can act without that sort of mute compulsion or direct compulsion. You minimize compulsion. So so Arthur Lewis, who I'm showing on the right, was an important figure in decolonial movements in the 60s. He's important in nationalization of firms. And he talked about Kornai and lines where he said, making a plan is a struggle, exercise of the imagination, and implementation is a struggle with reality. And by contrast, on the left, I'm showing a wildcat strike leader named, and a refrigeration mechanic named Joseph Edwards, who argued that economic planning was impossible without an institutional arrangement that placed plan formation in worker councils. And he comes up with this after a bauxite strike in Guyana, shortly after nationalization. So it may have been nationalized, but it's not our firm, because we're still being told what to do. I feel like I'm still going to work, whether it's my people who are leading or it's British colonial officers who are leading my firm. So the most famous exponent of this is C.L.R. James. He was inspired by Athens in his belief that self-government was the only way to safeguard true socialist democracy against the menace of ever-growing bureaucracy. James is a Trotskyist, so he's very anti-Stalinist, and that's sort of informing this emphasis on direct democracy against bureaucratic compulsion. So I'll just sort of kind of conclude here, and maybe we can talk more about direct democracy in the extra session. But James's basic idea is that the only way you can prevent this rise of a bureaucratic class is by having, just emphasizing over and over again, direct democracy as part of the working day. So part of your day as a worker would be in self-management of your firm and self-management of society. And this really resonates with how we were thinking about Kornai's critique, because similarly, if people are involved in the creation of a plan and its larger interactions with society, sorry, there's a cat right here, that would be a way to avoid these despotic turns. So that will be something perhaps we can talk about in the Q&A, but I'll conclude on this idea that what these problems that we're talking about of direct democracy, we might call them non-ecological arguments for eco-socialism, and that imagining a world with minimal coercion and maximal democracy and limited alienation, so the things that are required to prevent the need for that top-down coercion or market-based coercion in coordinating a society, is that they require time for deliberative democracy. They require minimal amounts of extractive, unpleasant work, because that sort of work is harder to coordinate voluntarily, I suppose. So economic democracy must be slow to prevent a parasitic party state from forming, global to incorporate planetary strengths, and ecological to ensure liberation for all living beings, or it will be nothing. Thank you, and sorry for going over.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you very much. I will introduce our next two speakers. Well, actually, it will be Johannes and his co-author, Anna. Johannes is a postdoctoral researcher and member of the biomaterialities team, as I said before, where he's in charge of a work package on the topic of work, value, and technology in the bioeconomy. His research combines political economy and political ecology perspectives, particularly eco-Marxism. He has, with his training in literary and cultural studies. His most recent work includes an edited volume on automation and Marxist approaches to technology, which is called De-Automating the Future and came out with Brill in 2024, and an article on valorization through carbon farming schemes that came out earlier this year in Ecological Economics. His co-author, Anna Saave, who is unfortunately not here because of illness, is a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair for Environmental Planning and Transformation at Freiburg University. She was also a former member of the Biomaterialities Research Group, and her research interests include feminist economics, sustainability, and forestry, among others. Her recent work includes the monograph Einverleiben und Externalisieren, which came out with transcript in 2022, and articles and book chapters on care, extractivism, degrowth, and feminist economics. So thank you, Johannes. We're looking forward to your talk. It seems like Johannes is frozen, his screen is frozen, so wait a second.
I can quickly call him.
Yeah, I think it's an internet. Here.
He comes back.
Okay.
Hey. Johannes?
Oh, no.
Johannes?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, sorry, my Zoom just died because I opened the PowerPoint presentation. I hope it works now.
The floor is yours, Johannes.
Yes. All right. You hopefully can see my screen now, right? All right, excellent. So I will present ideas of an ongoing investigation into the learnings from ecofeminism and eco-Marxism about the debates for democratically planned post-capitalist societies, which I've been working on with my colleague Anna, who is going to be here, but unfortunately now can't because she has been sick the entire week. So yeah, apologies for that. So in our work, after reading a little bit into the democratic economic planning debate, we began with the question of what can current debates on democratic planning learn from ecofeminist and eco-socialist approaches. And the reason for that is that they are generally not very present in that debate. So in order to talk about this, we will do a couple of things. We will first reflect briefly on motivations for planning. Drew has talked a little bit about this, but maybe we have a slightly different perspective. Then we will talk to eco-Marxist and ecological insights, then to feminist insights, and finally have a conclusion, a way forward with a question mark and an exclamation point. And as you will see there's a lot of question mark and very little exclamation point. So let's begin with the first question. Why planning and why are we talking about this now? So this debate originally, as Drew was saying, goes back to people like Hayek. So it's been around for almost 100 years now. But it has recently resurfaced since the 80s, approximately in the last 10-ish years within circles that are more interested in ecological concerns. So the first reason for this is the link between environmental degradation and capitalism, which even mainstream scientists nowadays agree that this is a thing. And very shortly, this is about because capitalism is systemically needs to emphasize profit maximization over ecological sustainability. This is also something that came up in the research project repeatedly. And then on the social side, we have unequal class relations, exploitation, gendered, racialized, geographic dimensions of inequality, and so forth. To address this question, not only in the form of a negative critique, but in the form of a positive, or as Drew and Troy would have it, a utopian vision, the left has recently seen the rise of a new generation of thinkers suggesting that these questions can be solved through economic planning. A common point of departure is that non-planned markets are fundamentally incapable of directing the economy at large towards collective human needs. Since the countless independent economic units operate atomistically, following what Søren Mau with Marx has called the mute compulsion of economic relations, and unrestrained markets cannot ensure social equality and ecological sustainability, the argument goes that we must therefore explore alternative ways to design a post-capitalist future that prioritizes human as well as ecological well-being over profits. The second major premise, and this is what Drew has also talked about, is that we need to learn from the mistakes and the debates of the past, and specifically, we need to avoid the problems of non-democratic economic planning. So the information problem that Drew has mentioned, as well as the coercion problem that Drew has talked about, and also the solution of market socialism, which tends to just collapse over time into just markets and no socialism. So Jakob Heyer defines or sums up the challenges that a planned economy needs to address as follows. The basic economic problem of a democratically planned economy is how can plans, decisions, and actions of myriad local productive units be reconciled with each other, with consumers, communities, and with democratically determined societal goals, for instance, environmental and social requirements. That is, how can planning and activity on the macro and on the aggregate micro level converge? Now, for the most part, the debate has focused on the first aspect of this problem, democratic planning as an economic problem. Many of the contributions have been very technical, weighing, for instance, alternative measures of accounting, such as labor time, or discussing the challenges of efficient and truthful communication of information and coordination. What we regard in our inquiry as at least as important is the second part, however. Planning in accordance with social and environmental necessities. Since we start from the conviction that a transition to a socialist or democratically planned society is a necessary condition for a socio-ecological transformation, but it is by no means a sufficient one. This may seem almost banal. Nevertheless, socialism or democratic economic planning is too often treated as if it were a guarantee to reach these goals almost automatically. We contend, however, with Drew and Troy that a socio-ecological transformation will still require compromises. Contrary to techno-optimist socialists, we do not expect technological and scientific advances to solve all problems and questions objectively, because they simply cannot be solved objectively. So it's not an information problem, but it's a problem of how to assess different competing needs and wants within a society. At the same time, democracy is the second bit, and kind of the cure that's being suggested is also somewhat problematic, at least, or in particular, if we understand it in the liberal democracy of consumers as which we commonly understand it today. Frequently, there is a collision between objective ecological boundaries and class-based, gendered, racial, or geographic inequalities. What this means is that we not only need to transform the production and distribution of goods so that highly industrialized societies stay within ecological boundaries, we also need to transform power hierarchies that are ingrained ideologically as well as economically. And this is where the social or feminist bit comes in. We believe that ecofeminist and eco-socialist perspectives can help us to identify some of the challenges and breaking points of previous models of democratic economic planning and also suggest some avenues forward. Let us begin by looking at the ecological or eco-socialist or eco-Marxist perspectives. So perhaps the most central aspect that this angle offers is a materialist method that integrates a social analysis, particularly a critique of the political economy and how this relates to ecology. And it does this by looking at natural science, or ideally it does that by looking at natural science insights and seeing how the natural and the social sciences can inform each other. For instance, the idea of planetary boundaries that might be malleable but that are not indefinitely expandable is absolutely central here, and it is central in both arguing against capitalism and also in arguing against previous non-ecological Promethean Marxisms, which tended to sideline these in green growth fantasies. So we have capitalist green growth fantasies and kind of socialist green growth fantasies, and both of these tend to ignore material throughputs. Eco-Marxist thinkers today by and large insist on planetary boundaries while refuting Malthusian arguments about an unmediated relation between the number of human beings and their ecological impact on the one hand, and romanticizing rejections of technology on the other. While we are not the first to make this observation, it is still very much a marginal one in the democratic planning debate. The group Planning for Entropy has engaged with the main models of planning by Devine and Adelman, Albert and Fehrle, and Cockshott and Cottrell, and insists on incorporating insights from ecological economics about the throughput of energy and the social metabolism. They highlight the material dimension of the human metabolism and that want to connect it with, or insist that it needs to be connected to the environment, and that this, quote, cannot be resolved through allocation or redistribution. Instead, human economic activity needs to be put into the larger, what they call, biophysical scale. It needs to be understood as a series of, quote, material flows subject to a series of metabolic transformations from source to sink. One of the disciplines that they suggest offer viable tools is ecological economics. Jakob Heyer and Walter Zeug, who's also here, have likewise suggested methods from ecological economics, such as an advanced life cycle analysis as a basis to better understand what happens materially and metabolically in production, and tying that into democratically planned economies. While I cannot go into detail about these suggestions, and Walter's here anyway and more qualified to answer these than I am because he developed this model, what I want to highlight is the way in which all of these thinkers stress that democratic economic planning needs to be aligned more closely with the material reality of limits, and limits both in the local and in the global sense. What these models suggest is a point that Drew and Troy have also highlighted, namely that a society that is organized in accordance with ecological principles will not be, quote, able to offer everything to everyone, and will thus need to manage scarcity. Sorry, I think I skipped a couple of points there. In other words, we need to come to terms with limits. Of course, capitalism doesn't offer everything to everybody either, but it creates the illusion that it does so. An honest leftist vision of a democratically planned economy, in contrast, needs to, as Cédric Durand, Elena Hofbert, and Matthias Schmelzer have begun to think about, plan beyond growth. We find this potential tension between the aspect of democracy and planetary boundaries largely unaddressed in the debate so far. The democratic literature agrees that resources should be distributed according to local needs, and it also tends to vaguely refer to that there are ecological limits and it needs to stay within them, but there are very few concrete suggestions on how to ensure that the aggregate demands made by local production units, however these are organized, will not exceed planetary or local boundaries. Even if scientists reach a consensus, how are we to enforce that the aggregate producers and consumers adhere to it? What if people as consumers collectively and democratically choose to ignore climate science or other ecological imperatives? Is it our quote-unquote democratic right to continue to destroy the future livelihood of humanity and other species? Or do we follow Andreas Malm's conviction that we need a quote-unquote ecological Leninism to ensure that the planet remains in conditions that allow continued good life for all people? The planning literature by and large, and so far as it does address these questions, seems to be on the side of Kate Soper's optimism about a post-growth hedonism that will allow the collective rationality of humans to adhere to external boundaries without being forced to do so. So Zamia Mohammed is one of the thinkers who has thought about this, and she has argued recently that an ecological democratic plan would necessitate a new understanding of freedom that differs from bourgeois liberal negative freedom as, quote, something pre-existing that everyone possesses and has to defend against others. And instead, she says that we need to develop a freedom which, quote, is collectively produced and sees in the other not its limits, but its condition of possibility. As we can see, taking ecological limits seriously poses a considerable challenge. We have an equal challenge if we turn to patriarchal power relations, where feminism and ecofeminism can complement these ecological considerations and embed the questions of planning against the Anthropocene crisis in a power-critical perspective. So we believe that feminism and ecofeminism, or feminisms and ecofeminisms, are uniquely positioned to inform the project of a democratically planned economy in the Anthropocene, as they critically examine the root causes of crises in the living conditions of contemporary societies and often link these concerns to ecological destructions, at least in the case of ecofeminisms. Scholars like Maria Mies have challenged the growth paradigm, interrogated the master model of Western societies as a matrix of domination, that's Val Plumwood, or Vandana Shiva has exposed how corporate greed threatens both the livelihood of peasant farmers, many of them women, and the biodiversity of crops, linking again the social and the ecological. Despite the prominence of feminist positions on the left, we find a situation that is similar to the ecological perspectives in the second wave of democratic economic planning from the late 1980s to the early 2000s, namely that there is very limited attention given to key concerns of feminism. There's very little discussion of care work, social reproduction, and the gendered division of labor. A few examples include Pat Devine, who early on acknowledged the need to abolish the gendered division of labor and advocated for women groups as part of the decision-making bodies that are central to his model. But most theorists including Leibman, Albert, and Hanel, who are some of the main thinkers of the second wave, in their models treated reproductive labor as peripheral, focusing rather on productive labor. Cockshott and Cottrell, on the other hand, went further than most in recognizing unpaid domestic labor as a form of exploitation, proposing, for instance, communes with shared childcare and kitchens as a solution. But the problem of their model is that it remains extremely productivist, viewing communal childcare primarily as a means to free women for higher and implicitly more productive activities within society, rather than valuing care as a central form of social reproduction.
Johannes just wanted to remind you of the time.
Yes,
Yep.
I will try to speed up. Jumping to the third wave then, in recent contributions, we also have an omission. So what Heide Luthesch has said is that there is often only a polite nod to reproductive labor, and systematic organization of this labor is largely underdeveloped. Fehrle actually revisited part of his earlier work, and he proposed that we need social mechanisms to encourage men's participation in care work. But again, this is largely voluntary in this model. So taking up Luthesch's call and coming to an end here, what can we learn from ecofeminisms and feminisms? So we identify 4 points that we consider central. Firstly, we need to center democratic economic planning on non-workers, or quote-unquote non-workers. So those working in caring, subsistence, and reproductive labor. And the key here is that not only are they currently unpaid, but the work which they perform is essential, and their livelihoods therefore need to be secured, and they need to have a livable existence. In addition, there is a problem which feminist economics is called divergent productivities, which means that while a lot of consumer good production can be sped up, the kind of work that goes on in care work often cannot. Secondly, needs coverage and voluntariness. So there is a division within feminist approaches, with some proposing organizing care as a commons, and others advocating for communal care work as much as possible, even automating it where it is sensible. These need to be negotiated because they're obviously going in different directions. But what we want to highlight is that we need to we need to provide care even to those who may not reciprocate. So those who are seen as undeserving, who may not contribute to society equally, and who maybe even aren't particularly thankful for being cared for. Thirdly, we see time as a critical resource. If we look at the distribution of labor, Gabriele Winkler has shown that 64% of all work in Germany includes care work, 8% as paid labor, and 56% as unpaid work, and that this imbalance is no accident. So capitalism, as we know, remains profitable in part because it builds on this huge mountain of unpaid reproductive work. And in a liberated society, we will still need this work, and this work will still be time intensive. So we need time budgets for care that must be transparent and collectively negotiated. Lastly, we believe that ecofeminism can provide a link between labor transitions and a more sustainable metabolism. The basis of this is a study from the UK that investigates that work in care sectors is often less resource intensive than other types of work. And we believe that with Ariel Saleh, we can build on meta-industrial labor, so work by indigenous communities, women of color, occurring in the margins of the capitalist market, to support this kind of work, because this work is ecologically less destructive than the kind of productivist work in Western industrialized societies. So ecofeminist perspectives then offer, on the one hand, new questions, but also offer new solutions to the problem of democratic planning. And they suggest that making metabolically beneficial reproductive forms of work key components of an economic model could kill two birds with one stone. It could alleviate gendered power imbalances and help us transition to more sustainable ways of living. Wrapping up, we have ecological and feminist perspective as largely absent from the second wave of democratic economic planning and only beginning to be discussed in the planning literature in the third wave of the last 10 or 15 years. We still find that ideas are often very vague and abstract, and we've also find that there's a hope that transitioning to a democratically planned economy somehow magically solves the problems of ecology and inequality, and that these thorny issues will sort themselves out. But we contend that this will probably not happen, and that there is in fact a tension between, on the one hand, expert knowledge on things like ecological aspects and potentially democratic decisions, particularly if they are informed by capitalist wants like consumption, unlimited consumption. We secondly see a tension between reproductive labor and established hierarchies and belief systems, and particularly if we want to shift reproductive labor in society to be more equitable. We do believe that these aspects need to be addressed as political problems, not as technical design problems. And we also believe that planning models would be well advised to work on these solutions. And that's where the question mark comes from, because we do not have a solution to those problems ourselves yet. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for going over time.
Okay, thank you, Johannes. Yeah, we are in the session already over, but I think we will keep to the time also that we allotted to the comments, and then we'll just have less time in the end for discussion. Oh, Johannes, I think I don't know if you're frozen again. You might be. But yeah, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce the person who will be the commentator for the session, and that is Marius Bickhardt, who is a doctoral candidate in political theory at the Center for European Studies in Sciences Po in Paris and at the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin. His research focuses on overpopulation theories of environmental Malthusianism and ecological Marxism. And his most recent publication is an article on overpopulation theories by Marx and Malthus in the journal Procla. So Marius, thank you very much for doing the comments in the session, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Miriam. Yeah, I'm really happy to participate in this session, and I'm really happy to that Johannes and Miriam invited me, since we investigate these questions together since a long time. We had an Eco-Marxist reading group, notably. And yes, so I prepared a set of comments that maybe resemble too much sort of a paper, but I try to stick to the time. And what I kind of tried to do is to let's say map and bring together like the general stakes of the debate around eco-socialist planning. And so obviously Trivetisis and Drew's book was a really important reference also for uh, for me and colleagues of mine, whom we are preparing together a short book about ecological Marxism that will be out in French next year. So I'm kind of presenting some of these ideas in the form of a comment. I unfortunately don't have slides, but I have I have a Word document that I would maybe just share, so it will be easier for you guys to follow. That's okay. Do you see the screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so just I gonna start. So as we just saw, the debate about planning was relegated to the margins of history after the collapse of the socialist bloc, but it resurfaced now through the ecological lens. And I think one of the stakes of this debate is that it helps us to move beyond this stark polarization within ecological Marxism between advocates of eco-socialist degrowth on the one hand, so Michael Louis, for example, in France, um, and proponents of socialist eco-modernism on the other hand, so Matthew Huber or Lee Phillips. While the former call for democratically planned reduction of production and consumption, the latter advocate for a Green New Deal based on public investment to accelerate decarbonization. Focused primarily on the question of growth, should it shrink or expand? This controversy tends, however, to obscure implicit points of convergence. So, on the one hand, the shared commitment to dismantling the fossil fuel industry in favor of renewable energy, but also the importance of ecological planning, which is basically a sort of common assumption in this like new polarized debate. So I want to map some of these like maybe core principles or like main features of eco-socialist planning. So I think first, what planning helps to think through is the orchestration of different imperatives of the energy transition. Second, an ecological revision of what Marx called the realm of freedom, of what he called communal wealth and real needs. Third, a conception of eco-socialist conflicts beyond the idea of a communist end of politics, where Havel's socialism was notably very helpful. And also, lastly, a theory of the eco-socialist subject, which would be able to impose such a eco-socialist planning project. So as Durand and Kishian in their planning book from last year argue, ecological planning brings together in a single framework the dismantling of carbon-based infrastructures and the reconstruction of decarbonized systems. So it kind of helps to think both of these two imperatives as a single process. So it is both a policy against fossil capital, but it's also a guiding principle for future eco-socialist coordination. The idea is, as we just saw, the socialization of the means of production, which allow their democratic and ecological control. And the socialization breaks with the privatization of economic decision-making by fossil capital, which is driven by short-term profitability. So the maximization of exchange value is replaced with an organization focused on the production of use values and the satisfaction of fundamental social needs. And I think here also it's very important to make the distinction that specific eco-socialist accounts of planning differ from green Keynesianism in the sense that the latter's vision of like a green mixed economy implies a merely partial form of the socialization of the economy and of investment. So now I come to the second point that also Johannes just developed, which concerns the horizon of emancipation and the concept of freedom, which is implied often in eco-socialist planning theory. So I think basically the eco-Marxist revival of planning either requires or often explicitly does a re-examination of Marx's conception of communism, where famously in Capital Volume 3, he develops this distinction between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. A distinction that he develops drawing on Aristotle Aristotle's distinction between poiesis and praxis. So poiesis as an activity that has the end outside of its own activity, and an ethical activity, the praxis, which is like has an end in itself, and also like the German idealist distinction between freedom and necessity. And so in Capital Volume 3, he says, the realm of freedom begins only where labor, which is determined by necessity, ceases. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production. And he kind of concludes this section by saying, beyond it begins the development of human power, which is its own end, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can flourish only when, with this realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day is its fundamental premise. So maybe just to very quickly say what Marx implied here in his definition of communism and what it means for our eco-Marxist debates today and planning debates. So he basically breaks with Engels' idea that socialism is the leap of humanity out of the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom. Marx's own position is that he wants to overcome this sort of idealist opposition between labor and freedom. So emancipation is thought as a dual process, both technical and social. So the technical aspects means liberation from labor through the reduction, through its reduction, through rising productivity, but also a new freedom within labor through the abolition of wage labor and the division of capitalist division of labor. So the first extends the realm of freedom, and the second transforms the realm of necessity. So this is kind of the conceptuality that Marx develops. But and I'm referring here to a colleague, Thea Haug, who worked a lot on this question. Actually, there's a difference between Grundrisse and Capital when Marx basically in Capital introduces a normative hierarchy between the two spheres of realm of necessity and realm of freedom. And so here he says that the essential, like that the essential condition of freedom is not the transformation of labor, the transformation of the realm of necessity, but rather its reduction. Which means that sort of like material activities in the realm of necessity have sort of like an ontological stigma of something which can't be free, of heteronomy. And so what is the implication of this? I think advocating an indefinite reduction of labor time as the foundation of the true realm of freedom hinges on a productive enrollment of nature conceived as a constraint to be overcome. Although Marx never envisioned the abolition of necessary labor due to its metabolic definition, if labor is the metabolic mediation between humanity and nature, it can't be abolished by its very definition. But he nonetheless conceives emancipation as an autonomy at nature's expense, or as an autonomy which has to sort of yeah, sort of like put nature at distance. And I think this idea of emancipation through a labor time reduction and through productivity gains also was very popular in the first wave of eco-socialism in the 60s, notably in Andre Gortz and Herbert Marcuse, who condition also emancipation on full automation of production. But I think in eco-socialist planning debates, we find a new understanding of the realm of freedom and of the relationship between the two. So the eco-socialist Robin Eckersley, for her part, for example, rejected the opposition between genuine human freedom and humanity's embeddedness in nature, where the two would appear as inversely correlated. And this same idea also is visible in ecofeminist Maria Mies' account of the realm of necessity. So this kind of echoes what Johannes just developed. So regrounding emancipation on an alternative conception of time, that it is irreducible to the division between labor and leisure, and which also is not applicable to reproductive activities, feminist theorist Maria Mies situates the process of liberation within the very terrain of life making or the production of life. She thus stands in contrast to the idea that fulfillment, here I quote her, fulfillment, autonomy can only be achieved outside the sphere of necessary labor through reduction or abolition of the latter. And this is basically an argument that also Alfred Schmidt already did in his book on Marx's concept of nature, where he sort of lamented that Marx reduces emancipation to the curtailment of labor time. But I think by abandoning any normative hierarchy between material production and the truly free, a truly free sphere, a reconceptualization of an Anthropocene ideal of emancipation unfolds through a double movement. So it acknowledges the ecologically destructive nature of an indefinite decoupling of productive growth and the persistence of material activities, reproductive labor, and eco-regulatory practices that cannot be mechanized. And these material activities aren't very visible in this Marxian definition of the true realm of freedom, which is predicated upon a reduction of labor time through productivity increases, right? So Anthropocene freedom thus depends not merely on freeing up lifetime through productivity gains, but on the collective maintenance of human and non-human life conditions as a foundation of individual and collective flourishing. So how much time do I still have? Approximately.
About 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. What does it mean, like this redefinition, eco-socialist redefinition, an overcoming of necessity and freedom, as a duality? What does it mean with respect to the idea of material abundance and in eco-socialistically planned economy? So there are some that argue that the ecological impossibility of endless growth and material production demands a conception of autonomy without abundance, like the French philosopher Pierre Charbonnier, for example. But on the other hand, the technical potential of decarbonization fuels also the hypothesis of a solar communism grounded in an energy system based on the abundance of solar energy, as in the case of Matthew Huber. And I think here in eco-Marxist, eco-socialist debates, there's a really interesting rereading to kind of go beyond this opposition between ecological renunciation of abundance or its technological rehabilitation. And this is done through the rereading of Marx's distinction between abstract and concrete wealth. So bourgeois wealth is only like this gigantic collection of commodities, as Marx said in Capital. But communal wealth, as Marx said, cannot be reduced to a mere technological threshold. It is measured neither in value, nor in money, nor in labor productivity, but derives from a new social relation, as Aaron Benanav and Koisato argued, which is oriented toward the production of qualitative use values determined by social needs. And Saito calls this a qualitative development of the productive forces of social labor. It's a very interesting idea in my understanding. But I think there needs to be a condition that has to be introduced in this rereading of communal wealth, because to make it compatible with an eco-socialist planning framework, the idea of collective self-limitation of social needs that Harvard socialism also, for example, emphasized a lot, needs to be taken into account. So Durand and Keshayan, they argue for like a sort of like a self-limitation and self-deliberate, like a self determination of collective needs, where artificial needs are replaced by real needs, and real needs are defined as with both an ecological criteria, so the compatibility with planetary habitability, and a social one, that everyone who wants to satisfy this need is able to do so. So here we see there's an ecological Marxist conception of radical abundance, which is a notion that has mostly been put forward by degrowth scholars. So rather than elevating the growth of productive forces and the reduction of labor time that it allows as the essential condition of freedom, as Marx said, collective self-limitation treats technology as a means and not as an end of free flourishing. So the boundary between artificial and real needs is therefore continually renegotiated because humanity's material footprint can be shrinked in different ways. So on the one hand, we can abolish artificial needs that would, as Saito says, extend the realm of freedom without increasing productivity while shrinking the scale of production. But on the other hand, and this is like more like the emphasis of the eco-modernists, let's say, the rise of decarbonization technologies that enable the increase, the per capita increase of energy, available energy, while also reducing CO2 emissions, could allow that certain of artificial needs are reclassified or reclassified as real needs. Okay, I come to my third point, which I will sketch very briefly. This is the question of the end of politics. And so in Harvard socialism, there's this really interesting idea of eco-socialist trade-offs, which basically, in my understanding, goes against the classic technocratic horizon of planning, where, according to Friedrich Engels, the government of people gives way to the administration of things. Because this very self-limitation that I just self-limitation of needs presupposes deliberative mechanisms. So there's no idea of like an end of politics, as for example Charles Fourier tended to imply in his harmonist utopia, but there's sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that an eco-socialist society has a sort of like irreducible conflictuality in the Anthropocene. And therefore, planning could mediate between various political and technological pathways and choices, notably to address land scarcity. This is a fact that Drew and Troy emphasized a lot in Harvard socialism. So how, for example, can large-scale solar and wind infrastructures that are land-intensive be reconciled with the dual imperative of preserving farmland and protecting rewilded zones to slow species extinction and prevent pandemics? So these are the kind of trade-offs and like sort of like eco-communist politics that planning debates develop. I think I will be very brief on the idea of calculation in kind. This that had been also mentioned already in the talk of Drew. This is a very central idea in the planning debate, and the idea is that the sort of single metric of price needs to be transcended by like a sort of multi-dimensional multi-criteria planning economy. So this is a very important feature, and I think the originality of Harvard socialism in this respect is the emphasis on the scale, on the planetary scale of the problem. Whereas, for example, Durand and Keshian sometimes seem to imply like a merely like green Keynesian national scale of planning. And also like the foregrounder of basically the founder of ecological Marxism as a discipline or as a like a scholarly and politically formalized space of debate in the US, James O'Connor, he already emphasized the need to transcend the local and the central within new political forms of planning. Okay, last but not least, so another aspect, maybe I just briefly mentioned the fact that last but not least, the problem of scale is not only like the calculation in kind, which has to like sort of acknowledge like planetary flows of matter and energy and like sort of be able to modelize them, but it also has the political implication of like sort of reconciling like local forms of autarky with interterritorial solidarity, which is very important to address the social spatial inequalities in the distribution both of causes, effects, and adaptation capacities in the context of the Anthropocene. So this is why the planetary scale is very, very important of planning. Last but not least, I will be really brief on this. Who is the subject? Who's the eco-socialist subject that is able to sort of realize this political project of eco-socialist planning? And I think it's a really important question since there's like this risk of like sort of like an autonomization of like planning bureaucracies, like Drew just called them like sort of like a parasitic class of like sort of like planners that um, sort of escape any form of democratic control at the expense of workers, notably. Um, so in other words, who will build the ark, as Mike Davis famously put it? I think basically political ecology said in the moment of its very formation in the 70s, 80s, we need a farewell to the working classes, Andrew Gorde said. And very recently, like sort of more like liberal environmental humanities, like Bruno Latour, Nikolai Schulz, emphasized also the need of a new ecological class, which would break with like Marx productivism. And I think that like eco-Marxist theoreticians had a double-sided strategy to respond to this sort of farewell to the working class rhetorics in political ecology. So how can you conceptualize an environment proletariat? And I think this question is also, it reopens this stake of a plural composition of the revolutionary subject, which had been central in Marxist debate since the rise of peasant and feminist struggles in the 20th century. So the ecological question is only like sort of rebroadening again this question of plural composition. And I think there are two strategies. There's a strategy of reaffirming the centrality of the industrial proletariat, as Matthew Huber argues. He notably says, there's the paradox of the climate movement. So we have to transform the mode of production, the fossil mode of production, but environmental conscience is sort of mostly like embodied by the PMC, like the professional managerial class. So he highlights the importance of like electrical sector unions for decarbonizing the economy, given their high unionization rates and their militancy. And on the other hand, there's another strategy which could be framed as the Red-Green Alliance. So O'Connor already in '88 emphasized this need of like an alliance between political ecology and the working class through the formation of a socio-ecological bloc. Michael Louis and Daniel Tannerow say that the 21st century will be the century of the eco-social question and a convergence of environmental and social struggles. And Stefania Bacche and Emmanuel Leonardi also emphasize this sort of red-green alliance with this term, the concept of the ecology of the working class. Okay, so sorry for going over time. But yes, I just briefly wanted to sort of map these core principles, maybe one could say, of eco-socialist planning. It was a very brief sketch, but maybe it's helpful like to have like a sort of a clarification of what are the general stakes of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. And thank you for all three of you, Drew, Johannes, and Marius, for each of your laying out of the terrain from your perspective of what are the central pillars maybe to think about in terms of economic planning. Now I would like to, just open the floor to everybody else who is here in the room, who I know some people have a lot to say about this topic. If you'd like to join in and start the debate. It's also possible to have reactions among the three of you, perhaps to each other. This would be a good opportunity to do that as well. Drew.
I'll be quick so Walter can also say something. But I was really struck by the resonance between my talk and Johannes's talk, and this emphasis on. I didn't get to talk about as much as I wanted to on the end of this need of, if we want to minimize coercion, which I think we need to do for planning to be legitimate, to have this sort of this solution, this Pornian binary, we need to have this, expansion of the realm of freedom, minimization of the realm of necessity, but also, as Marius was saying, transforming the realm of necessity to make it, less unpleasant. And I think that's something that's really encouraging to see is coming up, because these problems of how is it that we can, have a world where there needs to be some amount of mining, some amount of these extractive, unpleasant activities in such a way that we don't have the way capitalism organizes this, which is have some underclass do this work or have some sort of compulsion going on. So just wanted to flag that it's some things in the air maybe, and there's this interesting, I guess, less technical and more social focus emerging.
Thank you. Walter, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So Heide Lutosh and me were working for the last half a year on including, and not only including, but thinking democratic economic planning from a care perspective. I can just I don't want to elaborate on this now. You can find it on ResearchGate, a presentation we gave at the Degrowth conference in Oslo, if you like. However, what I would be interested in, and this is specifically a question to Johannes, and it would also be one to Anna, but what would be your definition of care work for non-capitalist or socialist or planned societies? Thanks.
That's a tough one, especially since it's not my kind of area of expertise. That's more Anna than me. But I think I would. I've kind of touched on care in the past, and one of the problems of this entire debate, in my opinion, is that it has very fuzzy definitions. So I think you're kind of putting a finger in the wound. But I would think in terms of like any kind of work that is primarily or necessary for reproduction, working with both other people who need it and also extending it beyond people. So like the idea of caring for the earth, caring for animals, plants, what have you. But of course, that's also a very fuzzy definition. So yeah, what I think that what the core is that it would be helpful or necessary to kind of reconceptualize work away from this kind of productivist, that's what I do for 8 hours and then I go home and then I don't work. That's been kind of dominant within Western societies for the past, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years, maybe longer than that. So, yeah. But I'd be interested to hear your definition as well, since you've worked on the topic.
Is it my turn?
I don't know if Walter wanted to reply to that directly regarding your definition of care work and the models that you've made, Walter.
Yeah, if you like, I can try to say something regarding that. So, what actually care work is, we have defined that or try to define this more or less in the upcoming work. And I totally agree to Johannes, so that it's not so easy to really differentiate, especially when you're tracking down specific activities. So what we are doing is we are having a look at, for example, of the Zeitverwendungsstatistiken, so of the time use statistics of the German Federal Statistical Office, and then to see, okay, for example, going with a child to a playground, is it care work or not? Gardening activities, is it care work or not? Right? So, and what we would say, what we do is we differentiate between institutionalized care work and non-institutionalized care work. And so care work in general is work which you do for a third person, which is depending on you. However, this is no vice versa relationship. So you do not get something back, or there is no both sides dependency, for example, as in a friendship or so. So this third party criteria in care work, I think in general is very important, that you are doing things not for yourself, but for somebody else who is depending on you. And then the differentiation between care work and non-institutionalized care work. Care work is something you do, for example, at home, where and which cannot be done not or in some sort of institution, because the care work is so a big need for an emotional but also spatial proximity. So you have to be so close that you cannot institutionalize it. And institutionalized would be then care work, yes, what you do for somebody else, what you do not for your own, but actually the person who does it, if he or she is qualified enough, is interchangeable.
So work within a relationship, for instance, that's equal would not be care work for you, if I understood it correctly? Even if that kind of balances over time, like, I don't know, if I'm having a bad time, my partner might care more for me if they're having a bad time and less energy. I think, like, overall, maybe it's reciprocal, but
Yeah. So the question is always what you want to do with the concept of care work, and what are you accounting? So for us, it's mainly something for accounting, and we do not want to have like a big brother who accounts everything what you do in a way. Yeah? So and you always have to differentiate between accounting, because there is some sort of societal deliberation of resources behind it. And this has to be accounted for this very specific reason. And activities which are nevertheless important and very important, but there is no need for a societal quantitative deliberation. And I would say for your case, it's very important to have this in mind. And of course, these activities are very relevant, but there's actually no need for real, let's say, overall societal accounting of this work. You can imagine also a lot of other activities which are maybe comparable to what you say, where yeah, we would not apply this is care work necessarily. So
Yeah.
care work in the sense of accounting it.
Cornelius?
I was only wondering in terms of time, right? Do we still have time for the question, or should we grant our attendance and like a short break before the next, or am I
Yeah,
kind of confusing things?
I think you might be. We start the next session at 4
Ooh.
o'clock, I believe.
Yeah, sorry, I confused things. Okay, yeah,
So we
then
have about 10 minutes, yeah.
okay, yeah, then there is enough time. But I'm not sure, Marius, did you wanted to kind of reply to the prior discussion? Because my question goes into a little different direction.
Yeah, maybe it will be a bit more linked to
Yeah, then maybe you go ahead, and if there is still time, I will
Yeah.
close my question in the end.
Yeah, no, I basically I won't be long. I just wanted to yeah, emphasize again that I had the impression there were like some echoes between the different presentations. And I think it's really interesting to see also what Walter Zeug just mentioned about their work on like eco-feminist accounting. That it's really interesting to see that there's a convergence now, or what Johannes and Anna call the sort of like a eco-feminist, eco-Marxist convergence in the planning debate. I think what is interesting is that the authors that contemporary ecofeminists go back to generally, like Marius, she, in my understanding, had a certain conception of like the peasant society, which is not necessarily compatible with, or like peasant subsistence, which is not necessarily compatible with the more, let's say, the more technophile aspect of like ecological planning and the macro perspective of having like, ecological accounting and like also implementing new forms of like decarbonization technologies that back in the days Maria Mies, for example, could not know of, and people would not talk about that back then. But so I think there's like something interesting, which also like an interesting convergence, but which probably make also for a need to break with certain maybe peasant romanticist like aspects in ecofeminism. Yeah, and the second point was about what Johannes said with respect to the labor time budgets. I think this resonates also with Mies' criticism of Marx's understanding of emancipation as the reduction of labor time, because what if I understood correctly, you consider this the necessity of reproductive labor time budgets. The idea behind is that this is incompressible, right? This is like incompressible, so we have to socially organize it, and I think there's some interesting, yeah, resonance, let's say.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, not incompressible, but the amount that you can reduce it is very limited compared to other productivist activities that you can automate. Or, I mean, that you may want to automate is maybe a better way of saying it, because of course there are caring robots and things like that now, but the question is that like a utopia or is that a dystopia if we imagine that we automate like care for old people, care for children, whatever, and what do we use our time for then? So it's this whole kind of idea of like redefining how we want to live as a society and as a community. And maybe since you were talking a lot about Marx, kind of reconnecting this break that has gone through modern societies, where it's the section of individuals each against another and kind of moving back towards a more communal and more social way of organizing what we do as a society.
Cornelius.
Yes, yeah, I wanted to raise a question that goes a little bit into a different direction, because mainly referring to Marius' intervention and so I don't come from an eco-Marxist perspective. I come from a more like STSy old school Latourian perspective. At least this is what I was trained in. And but now currently I'm playing around with the idea of kind of writing a text using or referring to this concept of the ecological class, but I'm not really sure if this text will materialize because the deadline is very soon and it would definitely be a sprint to write that. But I thought I'm just being opportunistic here, given kind of this condensed expertise in eco-Marxism. I just wanted to ask maybe the three of you, if you could elaborate a bit more on how the concept or this kind of proposition of the ecological class was received in your eco-Marxist circles. Is there a kind of a core to it, something you can work with something, or do you think it's complete nonsense, useless? That would be my question.
Do you want to go first, maybe Drew or Johannes?
You brought it up, so you can go first.
I mean, maybe to make, because Cornelius' question was broad, so and to all the three of us, so I thought also like the issue of the eco-socialist subject in, for example, half-earth socialism. I have the impression like it's not necessarily a very central question, but it's kind of always it's always in the background, in my understanding. I would be interested to hear Drew on that, because it's I have the impression like you tell the story of revolutionary planning experiments, also referring to Chile, for example. So I have the impression like you, or now you refer to Janusz Kornai and the Hungarian Revolution. So I have the impression is there's also an interesting link between the history of the revolutionary uprisings and conjunctures of struggle and class struggle, and their link to the renewal of planning ideas. And so also like in the Otto Neurath, right? He wrote in the midst of like right at the end of the First World War, in the midst of the November Revolution, and also Karl Korsch back in the days wrote about Sozialisierung, and so I think there's an interesting debate to have about this historical link between the like the revolutionary subject and its link to the to planning.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just following on that, there is sort of a distinction between Neurath, who really sets off the socialist calculation debate in the 1910s and 20s, who's part of a social movement, he's part of the German Revolution, and later he's involved in the Vienna like garden cities sort of movement of sort of mass squatters. And then similarly, Kornai is not really part of a social movement, he's part of a certain system of power, social, and then there's the Project Cybersyn. So that's distinct from the 80s, post 80s and 90s planning literature, which is mostly an armchair debate. I say this as someone who's happily sitting in an armchair right now, where the idea is something like, I think the distinction is, and this is sort of maybe a defense of utopianism on my part, is that there are movements that have certain like ideas of what post-capitalism could be like. This is sort of, Marx has this famous Bildungsverboten, this famous like no utopias statement. But I think that's really because he's writing in a time when people kind of remember what it was like to not have capitalism, and there are real movements like the Paris Commune that have really established ideas of what post-capitalism could be like. In my period, I would say, as a someone in a society that's been capitalist for longer than anyone can remember, that there's not really a deeply felt sense that there's an alternative. There's sort of this need for maybe some ideas, maybe some utopian provocations. So I think that's maybe the social context of this 80s and 90s to today planning literature, which is sort of it's a response to the failures of state socialism. It's a response to the left maybe in crisis. It's in maybe the most recent iteration, it's the left is sort of coming back and maybe needs some ideas of what it wants beyond, maybe slogans. So there's a certain social role that I would say the current democratic economic planning literature is playing that's quite distinct from the past. And how that relates to a social movement, I would say right now, maybe the audience of democratic planning literature, at least the way I conceive it, is I'm talking to the newly resurgent left in Western Europe and the US. That's my context. I would like to, speak to more, and as the book's been translated into Spanish and other languages, and Thai, I've heard a lot from other movements, but this context that I know, we're speaking to these sort of inchoate, decentralized movements, very, sort of labor is still weak. So it's sort of this, downwardly mobile, young audience, I would say, in some sense. So, that class composition, I guess, in some sense, has not been the main focus of our work. In some sense, maybe there's a social reason for that, which is that we're speaking to this sort of inchoate movement right now that seems to have this kind of complicated class mix. So I'm going to stop rambling there, but that's maybe a thought of what the social context of these different planning proposals are in. I don't know the social movement that's going to in capitalism. I don't know the coalition. I think it's going to be a broad mix of labor and other movements, feminists, ecologists, etc. I think scientists play a role, but that's not something I've solved. Yeah.
A good one to solve. Johannes, I would give you the last word, and then we will close the session.
All right. So I'm not entirely sure what your project is on, so maybe we can talk about this in another context. But it sounds interesting, and I haven't personally worked with this concept of the ecological class, but it's something that comes up repeatedly in discussions. And I would agree with Drew in terms of who's interested in democratic economic planning and in that whole debate. That I think is not who Mike Davis had in mind, for sure. So I think what Mike Davis was talking about is more closely related to things that are discussed in the environmental justice movement, for instance. But I also think in a sense, the link might be that even though Davis is not exactly utopian, this idea is maybe a little bit utopian, that environmental degradation will be so bad that there will be a class formation, and this class formation will then overthrow an unjust system. So that's maybe the link between what we're talking about and what he was talking about, or what that debate is talking about. Yeah, I don't see that happening right now in the real world, or not at large anyway. I think it happens occasionally and around very specific things, like resistance to mines and things like that. But I don't think it happens at large, but hopefully it will in time. So yeah, I guess that would be my closing word for this session.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Johannes. With that, and in light of time, we will close the session. The next session on valorization, financialization, venture capital, and startup economies will start in 20 minutes at 4 o'clock. So thank you for those of you who joined us here, and for those of us who will continue to accompany us in the next session, we'll start at 4 o'clock. Johannes and Cornelius, I wanted to ask you to stay on Zoom if you could, just for a few minutes. Thank you very much, especially to Marius, Johannes, and Drew. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Ich stoppe jetzt mal das Recording, aber wir haben das schon getestet. Das wird dann, ja,